This is third time lucky. I think
Yes.
first time we had booked, you had a minor health scare, and then last week you went flying in a helicopter. Is that right?
I went flying on the Sunday.
Yeah.
Yes.
How was that?
Oh, well, I started flying them in 1958.
Did it feel the same?
Helicopters, aeroplanes in 48, helicopters in 58.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I might just have one last flight. And I had my son here as well. He sort of arranged the timings and so on. I had a few spare seats, so I got a couple of girls and a friend come along. Had a great time.
And what sort of helicopter were you in?
And a squirrel
You've
helicopter.
flown squirrels before?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I've flown them a fair amount.
Yeah.
Mm.
Did you have a fly? Did he give you the stick?
No, no, had nothing in front of me whatsoever.
But did you feel
It
like you
was,
could do it? You know,
it
if he
was,
did.
yes, yes.
Amazing, eh? That's great.
No, had a very pleasant half hour.
Excellent. So I wonder if we can start off by talking about something that it's not normally polite to talk about, and that's your age.
Oh, yes.
But I don't know. It sort of feels like maybe when you get above 90 or something like that, it's probably okay to talk about your age because it becomes something impressive. So you're 96, is that right?
That is 96, yes, a couple of months ago,
Yep.
3 months ago.
Born in 1928.
28,
I just wrote down a few little stats here.
yes,
You started with the RAF in 1950, which was 74 years ago, which was
yes.
20 years before I was even thought of.
Oh, yes.
um, how does it feel? Can you describe your memories of when you're looking back to those early days of your life or your flying career? Does it feel like yesterday, or does it feel like 3/4 of a century ago
No,
in
it
your
seems
mind?
to be fairly clear about what happened.
Yeah.
I I did my first flight in 1934, sitting on my brother's knee with old Mad Mac McGregor, who was barnstorming around with a couple of his mates and old Gypsy 60s, I think they were.
And you can remember it like yesterday.
And I can remember that first flight wonderfully well.
Wow.
It was magnificent.
So you would have been
Out of the
six
paddock
or
cove
seven.
in Takaka, flew around the area. It was a beautiful day.
Mm.
I just thought it was magic.
What sort of aeroplane was it?
I think the Dauphin 60,
Right.
yes. Pre-Tiger Moth.
Right.
Mm.
Okay. In your head, do you feel like you're 96? I know when I'm 55 and you still think I'm 30, in your head you feel like you're younger.
That is about correct too.
You still feel like you're
Yes,
younger, even though you're nearly a
very
century
much
old.
so.
Yeah, it's amazing,
Mm.
isn't it? I often have to remind myself that 30-year-olds see me as an old man, even though I
Yes.
look at them and I sort of feel like I'm the same as them, but it's not the same, is it? Do you wish you could go back to those amazing things you've done earlier in your career, or do you feel like you've been there, you've done that, and you don't have a hankering to do them again?
No, I reminisce quite a bit
Mm.
about the early days and so on. There were some great times. It was easier to fly in those days. In fact, you did fly. I think nowadays you just press buttons and twiddle knobs and change frequencies and so on. In those days we didn't have any radio. And even when I got in the RAF, we only had a 4-channel radio, which you could use by pressing a certain button. If I remember rightly, was just the air traffic control to get airborne. B was for any flying around the airfield, and it'd be approach. C was a common RAF frequency. It was very busy. And D was the emergency. Those were the 4 channels you had.
And I think you said in your book if you wanted to speak on a different frequency, the crystal had to be changed.
When I flew from England to Iran, we had to change frequencies there, and we had to open up the cowling and put in a new crystal. And I remember in Aden it was 48 degrees, and it was so hot I could not change the crystal. Fortunately, I had another aircraft there, and a friend flying another aircraft, and he managed to change his frequency, and he did the radio work for both of us.
It's just a foreign world to us pilots, even when you said open up the cowling.
Yes.
You know, the idea of having a radio under the cowling is just odd now, isn't it?
Yes, it was the radio section was beside the engine, and that in 48 degrees centigrade, it was just too hot to handle.
It's a wonder anything kept going. It must be amazing when you look at today's high-tech society, and I suppose you have a phone, maybe an iPad and TVs and things, and then you look at the range of innovations that you've seen in your lifetime. Pretty much a century. I've just written down a few things. I wonder if you could talk about your memories of some of these when you were a child. Communications. So you wouldn't have had a telephone when you were a child at home, I guess?
At home, we didn't have one. We didn't have electric light. I remember electric lights coming in, being put in the house. And we had to be very careful because we would get blind if we looked at them for too long.
Is that what you were told?
Absolutely. We didn't have a switch. We had pull cords to turn the lights on and off, and it was very easy to disconnect those, just pulling a little bit too hard. It was all a nuisance.
Yeah, probably more dangerous than looking at the light.
Absolutely.
What about communicating with people overseas or even within New Zealand? I mean, you're writing letters and going on boats.
Letters. Absolutely.
So I often wonder how anything was achieved back then, because it would have taken a month or two for a letter to get there and a month or two to get back, and you're waiting 6 months for a reply,
yes.
Probably.
When I wrote, you asked if I could join the RAF, asked for their details. I sent it off airmail, and I think it was about 3 months later.
Even airmail?
I got a surface mail back.
Yeah, it's just a foreign concept now. Transportation. So were there cars? You were raised in Takaka. Were there cars when you were a child? There probably were.
Yes, we had a car there.
Yeah. But I think you said they were hand cranked, and I think you said that at the fuel pump at the gas station you had to hand pump it.
You had to hand pump the fuel. Yes, you'd pump it into a big glass cylinder, which I presume held a gallon. You'd empty that, then you'd carry on pumping and get the number of gallons you wanted.
And then you talked about your first flight in the early 30s.
34, yes.
34. And it's crazy to think that 20 years later, you were flying faster than the speed of sound yourself.
Pretty well, yes.
In the early 50s, that's unbelievable, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah. What else? Education. You mentioned in the first couple of years of your schooling, you wrote on slate tablets.
We did indeed.
You
and every now and again you'd drop it and the slate would crack.
Wow.
That was a sort of minor disaster.
Yeah.
You have a big crack going across your central page, as it were, your one and only page.
Which, when you finished, you rubbed it out, or
You rubbed it out, yes.
mm.
Yes, we had a slate pencil
Yeah.
and wall boards, of course, with chalk.
Mm. In medicine, you told a story about putting a garden fork through your foot at school,
Yes.
and the teacher tipping hydrogen peroxide onto it.
Hydrogen peroxide, put it in the top of the foot. It came out the bottom for it, I remember. And the perpetrator of the deed, he had to push me on my bike home, and that was it. Didn't see a doctor. I think Mum put on some more hydrogen peroxide or iodine, and that was it.
I bet that didn't feel too good on your foot.
I got into terrible trouble the following week because I thought I deserved a few days off, and I knew that my dad and one of my brothers was going fishing, and I wanted to go fishing. I was told I was lazy and idle, all sorts of things like that.
And another time you were injured or something happened, and you said you got this new wonder drug, penicillin, at Nelson Hospital.
Oh yes, I was at home. It was during the Christmas holidays. We all used to help the neighbours with haymaking and so on. And I was raking down the side of the stack, the big stack there. They had a long pronged pitchfork. I was scraping all the loose hay down off the side of the stack, and it slipped, and a tine, I thought, just dented my knee. That was all. Just the skin seemed to, it didn't break or anything, it just dented. And about half an hour later, I went to bike home at the end of the day, and I found it got very stiff. And it got pretty painful during the night. And the next day, I caught the bus into Takaka. Saw the doctor there. He said, "Oh, you'll have to go to hospital in Nelson." So we met up with the local schoolmaster who had a car. He drove me over the Takaka Hill. We had to stop twice, I think, to top up
Rebuild
with
the
water.
radiator, yep.
And I had a week in Nelson Hospital, and they gave me 4-hour injections with penicillin. It did a great job, but I got home a week later and I started to itch. And I'd have to get in under a cold shower to sort of cool myself down. And anyway, saw the doctor again, and he gave me some pills for it, and all went well.
It's amazing
So he
because...
said you're allergic to penicillin.
Oh, right. And you have been ever since?
Well, I've never tried it ever since. I've put it down as one of my things not to
Go there.
Not to use.
But I think that had only been out a couple of years, you know.
That's right.
It's crazy to think.
Yes, it was in it'd be the Christmas of 47, 48.
You can remember dates like they were yesterday. I can't remember what I did yesterday, but you obviously don't have any trouble.
I can remember some things quite clearly, yes. I associate it with something else.
Yeah, right. But, you know, we don't think now, but in the days before penicillin, I mean, people died from things like that, didn't they? Get an infection that didn't clear.
I guess so, yes.
What about changes in attitudes of society? If you were to compare society when you were a child and today's society, for example, would there be some obvious major changes that you could put your finger on?
Yeah, no one used keys. You went out of your home to go somewhere, to go fishing or into town or Nelson. You didn't lock anything. The place was fully open. Had to be the big change.
Yeah. And what doesn't change? Are we the same in some ways, do you think?
Can't think of anything offhand.
We're probably still like love and laughter and
Oh, we all had great fun, yes. There was always some trying to put it across one of your brothers or getting it put across you. And
we're just not allowed to do that too much these days because we can offend people very easily.
Probably, yes. Yes. We didn't have any stools when we milked the cows. We had an old 4-gallon drum, which I think we had kerosene in for the old lights and so on. And if you sit on the top of them more than a few times, they'd get a nice little dent in them. If you could get to the cow shed first, and you'd put a cup full of water in the top of the kerosene tin, and you'd have a good laugh when your brother or your dad came along and sat down on it, cleaning out the house, the cow shed at the end of the day with a hose. Everyone always got a bit wet somehow or another. We had fun.
Yeah.
We didn't have many children at school. I don't think they ever got any more than about 16 or something like that.
And that was the East Takaka Primary School?
That was the East Takaka Primary School. But you remained friends with everyone. Well, if you didn't, you'd never play a game. You had to be friends, and you were.
And I think you're planning to head back there in a couple of weeks.
Planning to get back Saturday week.
Wow.
And there'll be 3 there, 3 of us there, all in the same class at the same time.
Is that right?
Yes.
Wow. Have you stayed in touch with them?
I've stayed in touch with one of them. The other one moved up to the North Island. He was on Post and Telegraph, I think. And the other one remained local all his life on his dad's farm.
Well, that'll be great. So that's the 150th.
That's the 150th anniversary, yes.
Yeah. So you were, as we mentioned, you were brought up on a dairy farm in Takaka, and you had the military blood was in your family. Your dad fought at Passchendaele?
It wasn't in the family, but we went when we were wanted. That was none of us set out to become military or anything like that.
No, but you did it because you were born in those particular eras.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Dad was at Passchendaele in the First World War.
And how did that affect him? The First World War, did he talk about it? Did you notice how it affected him when he came back?
Yes, it affected him a lot. He was a machine gunner, so he would have been at the rear, fortunately. But I remember Mother always telling me every now and again that your dad had a bad night last night. He was shouting. And in 1959, he came over to see me when I was in England. And I happened to be posted out in Aden at the time. So he stayed with my wife until I came back about a fortnight. And she said there were several nights there when he shouted and screamed.
Wow.
I remember him telling me that he was so horrified. Well, when our artillery opened up, it was so muddy the artillery piece would move backwards into the mud, and when they fired, all the shells landed in amongst our own troops. Friendly fire, they call it nowadays. And I think he lost a lot of friends there because of that. And yes, it affected him 1917, was it, Passchendaele, to 1959, when he came to see me in England.
Yeah, it's terrible obviously people still go through these things in wars, but we understand PTSD and give people treatment for it. But back then, I'm sure it just wasn't a thing. You just had to live with it.
Yeah.
And you had an uncle that was killed in Gallipoli?
I had an uncle who was killed at Gallipoli, yes. He went over there on April the 25th. In June, he became a sergeant through vacancies, I guess. He suffered from dysentery and everything in August. They sent him off to hospital in Cairo until October. When he came out, he went back into the front line, I think the beginning of November. He was killed on the 19th of November, and the Anzac troops withdrew about 3 weeks later. It was a great pity.
Yeah.
It affected my mum an awful lot.
Was that her brother?
Because he was my mother's youngest brother.
Yeah.
And
you had two brothers that were pilots in World War II?
Two pilots, yes. One became a Pathfinder pilot. The other one got his wings in Canada and came back to New Zealand, and the Japanese surrendered. I had another one who started with the Air Force, but he had his gallbladder removed after a few weeks, so he was declared unfit. And the other brother only had one eye.
Oh.
He had had a cataract or something over it, so... Well, I was the only one who really missed out, I suppose, who was active.
Yeah, you were just born just a little bit late, I guess. Did you, after seeing what your dad went through and your uncle, and did it make you think like you don't want to go to war? Or I'm sure you would have if the timing was right.
I was quite happy to go over there and join the RAF. Not purely because I wanted to go to war, but because I wanted to learn to fly.
Yeah.
And my brother said, if you want to learn to fly properly, go and join the RAF.
So you were always keen on flying as a child?
Always keen on flying as a child. I was a bit put down when the RNZAF offered me a job as a navigator.
I bet you were.
It probably would have been about 6 or 8 on the course. So I think I mentioned that I worked at Takaka Cement Works for 2 months and 1 day and made £119. And that paid for my fare, which was £67, 5 shillings. And I think it would have been £64. But I have an idea of some tax was put on, and I had to pay the £67.
It's a bit rough. Did you have any doubts when the RNZAF turned you down as a pilot? Did you sort of think, maybe this is not for me, or maybe no, they're right and I can't do this?
By then, I had my private pilot's license. I got that down here in Nelson in 1949, when John Reed is the chief flying instructor. So I got my private pilot then. I always wanted to fly. And I probably mentioned in the book, I wrote to the Australians, the Canadians, the Americans and the RAF, and sent them all off airmail the next day.
Waited 3 months.
The Australians would have had me. They offered me a job, or possibility of a job. Canadians were a bit peculiar, and weren't helpful at all. The Americans, they thanked me very much for my interest in their forces, but they had made no provision for the procuring of foreign nationals for their air defence. And it was signed by Lieutenant Commander John D.W. Hazler, which I thought sounded very mid-European.
Yeah. Yep.
And as earlier said, 3 months later I got a brown envelope from the Air Ministry saying they'd accept me at 5 shillings a day if I made my own way over there.
You probably would have done it for nothing
Oh,
to start with anyway.
Yes.
You said you were so keen on flying as a child that you jumped off the roof with some wings on your arms.
Oh, yes.
That's
Very unsuccessful.
Was it? Surprisingly.
Yes.
And another couple of funny stories you mentioned, you used to make model balsa aeroplanes, and you talked about these tiny wee
Little
2-inch
flies.
ones.
Yes, I had blue-winged flies and I had red-winged flies. And
And how did you power them?
yes, and it was the big brown blowflies that seemed to be the better team.
And you have one engine or 2 engines?
Just one. I tried 2, but they'd never synchronise.
Engine failure procedures might be a wee bit dodgy.
Yes, they were no good on one.
Yeah. That's funny. You mentioned your first flight with MC McGregor.
Yes.
And he was trained by the Walsh brothers, I think. Was that right?
That's right. He did indeed.
It's amazing how short the history of aviation is. You know, I'm talking to you.
Yes.
You flew with him, and he was trained by the first in New Zealand. There's only 3 or 4 levels.
That's right.
Mm.
No, I saw something in the paper the other day. Oh, John King started a new journal called the Aviation Historians, about 4 issues a year, and he was mentioned in that.
Right.
Incidentally, he and his committee have made me an honorary member of the historical historical.
So they should too.
But I'm really no use to them because I was in England when all his historical stuff mainly took place in the 50s and 60s.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about your PPL at the Nelson Aero Club? What sort of aeroplane or aeroplanes did you
Moth.
train in? A Tiger? And what sort of exercises did you do back then for a PPL?
All the stalling and spinning.
You had to do
stalling and spinning before you could go solo.
Wow.
And then I'd go out and practice medium turns and so much cross country. When the time came, I think it was 25 hours. Someone came over from Wellington. He took me out the aeroplane. He said, right, you get in there. He said, I want you to take off, fly downwind, do a figure of 8, close the throttle, and do a forced landing onto the airfield. an old watch, and he leant up against one of the black hangers down there and watched me do all that. In the end, he signed me off for an endorsed private license, which I have there. When I did 50 hours or 40 hours or something, they gave me my pilot's license, which allowed me to carry passengers.
Well, look at this, 1949, medical examination, fit.
Yeah.
Didn't go into too much detail, just says fit. Well, that's great to still have. And who were the instructors? Were they ex-Air Force pilots or?
Yes, John. The first fellow I flew with Christ in the Canterbury Aero Club was Len Poor. He was ex-Air Force pilot. I didn't fly. He sent me solo. Then I came up to Nelson. And it was with John that I really started to do some proper training.
So 1950, as you mentioned, you got on a boat and went to England and joined the RAF. And I think you said you were the top pilot in your class.
We had 76 people on the course. 48 received their wings. And I was given the Glenn Trophy for the best pilot on the course.
Wow.
I thank the RNZAF a lot for that. It gave me a wonderful opportunity.
Were there any other Kiwis?
Not on that course. There are usually some on the course behind. Yes, there was one on my course, that's right. Chap Graves from Wanganui.
And what aircraft were you training in
That
the
was
RAF?
in a Percival Prentice.
Oh, wow.
A big sort of lumbering thing. And then after that, after 60 hours, went on to the Harvard.
Okay. And what was your first jet?
First jet was the VAM. Was for familiar flight and a Meteor 7. That was the only dual jet training aircraft in the Air Force.
Yeah.
We did sort of about 5 or 6 hours in that. And then I was put into a Vampire, and the instructor got 4 or 5 airmen to stand on or to sit on the tail boom to raise the nose. He said, "That's your landing attitude, away you go." So he watched me start, and I did my first flight on an old Vampire 1.
Was that a scary experience, the first flight by yourself in a jet?
No, not really, but I was a bit worried. We were using a short runway because of the crosswind, and I came in far too fast in the Vampire. I should have been slower. I was too used to the Meteor, which was faster. So I had to overshoot the first one, but I didn't dare the second one because just ran out of fuel.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Well, no pressure.
We only had enough fuel for generally around about 40 minutes flying.
But you made it.
We had no margins.
Yeah, so I suppose you got very good early on with pressure situations and dealing with.
Oh yes, you watched your fuel tanks very closely. And in the Vampire we had 5 tanks, 5 needles to watch, usually down behind the control column. And you had to add it all up, make sure you got back with plenty of power, plenty of fuel. In the Meteor, you're called downwind prior to landing was downwind. If you were less than 40-40, you had a priority landing.
What does 40-40
That's
mean?
40-40 gallons on each side.
And how long would that be in terms of time?
Oh, probably about 8-10 minutes, something like that.
Right. Yeah, we get so used to having half an hour or an hour left in the tanks.
You had nothing like that at all.
Yeah, yeah. They were such gas-guzzling machines, I'm sure.
Yes, they were.
Mm. And then your first posting was to Germany?
Was to Germany. We were forming a new squadron over there. Again, we were upgraded to the Vampire 5 and the Vampire 9, I think. There's no real handling differences between that and the Vampire 1. But it was an old aircraft. It was heavy on the controls and still, again, short of fuel.
Yeah.
So when the Sabre came along after 15 months, it was a completely new aircraft. We had powered controls. We had a standby power system.
For electrical system?
Yes. No, hydraulic, standby hydraulics.
Right.
We had radar sights, which was air conditioning as well.
Wow. And this was 1950.
This was in 1953.
Wow, it's an advanced aeroplane.
When we got those, yes.
And could you exceed the speed of sound in the Sabre?
Yes. Yes, vertically.
Right.
You had to dive vertically for that.
And that you did that on occasions?
Oh, yes. Sure? Yes, you didn't go very fast. You reach about 1.01 or 0.02. One day I got up to 50,000 feet and I got up to 1.1, which had not been done before, I'm sure.
So what was it like going faster than the speed of sound? Did you notice any difference in the flying abilities?
We were just sitting in a space where there was no air at all, no wind rushing past. And being American, it was just about as comfortable and roomy as we are here.
Wow. It's amazing because, I mean, how many years since Chuck Yeager first went through the speed of sound? It was only a few years earlier, wasn't it?
That's right, 1947, I think.
Yeah, so 5 or 6 years later, the advancement in technology is so it's become standard for fighter pilots.
Yes, it was necessary.
Mm. Were there any issues with aeroplanes breaking up or having issues in those early days, going faster than the sound barrier?
Well, I think the Havillands had a wee problem there. Hawkers and Supermarines, they came up their first aircraft. They had manual reversion from hydraulics. And they were pretty awful. There's every possibility you'd get about halfway, but from hydraulics into manual, and something would go wrong. It wasn't very good at all. And both of them at about 0.9678 or something like that, the controls just seized up, became absolutely solid. Whereas with the American Sabre, you could maneuver them.
Did they go heavy in the Sabre, or it just felt the same?
No, they felt just the same.
Wow.
But I remember on the dive when I got up to 1.1, I remember At 1.04, I started to pull out of the dive, and the controls were perfectly normal, as powered controls should be.
Yeah, yeah.
But the first Hunter and the first Swift, you just could not move those controls.
So, being the early 50s, I guess this was the sort of the early Cold War years.
Yes.
Was there a constant threat of conflict for you, being in a fighter squadron, or was that not really a
We
thing
always
at that
had a
time?
standby flight every day, or 5 days a week or something like that. I just forget. But we always had a flight standing by. It was more of a game than anything else.
Mm.
Only on a few occasions did we ever load up with ammunition, and we'd have a fuse wire across the firing button.
Was that for training or for
No,
threat of an
that was
exercise?
in case of necessity.
Right.
If things did change over, go to war.
Yeah. Was there any nuclear threat at that time, with Russia, or was that a little bit early, or the Soviet Union?
That was really a little bit earlier.
Mm.
Yes, that became more so towards the end of the 50s. I remember we were having courses on nuclear fallout and so on and so forth. But that would have been the late 50s.
So you were in a German town, I forget the name, and you mentioned there was quite a strong hatred towards.
Or Geilenkirchen. It was
How do you
just
say
on
it?
the Dutch border.
Guy and Kirsch.
Yes. In fact, our runway extended into Holland.
Right.
But we always used to do our shopping, everyday shopping, down in Heerlen, a Dutch town just on the border.
Yeah, it's something that I've never really thought of is, Germany or Nazi Germany had been defeated, but a lot of the locals would have still hated the Allied forces, and here you are just a few years later with a military base in their country.
I
What was?
found them delightful people to work with
Mm.
in
But
every way possible.
you told a story about your wife being spat on.
In Geilenkirchen,
Yeah,
yes.
was it just that one town or
That was just,
a few towns?
she didn't tell me that until later on. But that was the only occasion. But they weren't such a happy lot down there. I think the Americans had gone through that area, southern part of Germany, whereas in Oldenburg, where we were posted initially, up by Bremen, wife used to get on very well with the locals. She could go down. She was had been a stewardess of the British European Airways, so she had a smattering of German, and she could get onto the bus and go into town no problem whatsoever. And we were all relatively friendly.
So, in general, do you think the locals were pleased to see the end of the Nazis?
I think so, yes.
But were obviously just too afraid or to stand up against them because it was going to mean their lives.
Yes.
Mm. So you were married during your time in Germany, was that right?
That's right.
Your wife's name was Desi?
Jessie.
Yeah.
Yes.
And once you finished in Germany, you came back to England and did an instructor's course.
Yes.
Why did you choose instructing?
I didn't have any choice.
That's a good reason.
Yes.
How did you find it? Because I guess you had a lot less hands-on.
Yes, probably would be less. but we had about 24 on our course, and most of them, very nearly all of them, spoke Scottish, Liverpudlian, Welsh, Irish, 2 Thailanders, and myself.
Wow.
And I think probably because I spoke the best English, I was given these 2 Thailanders to work with and to keep an eye on. We got on very well indeed. They used to come round home for meals and coffee on Sunday mornings and so on like that.
So were they ab initio? Were you training them from scratch, or
Sorry?
were they brand new pilots?
No, they were doing instructor's course as well.
With the RAF?
With the RAF. Yes, just the course alone. And one of them came around one morning. I think he was a bit homesick. He started talking about Bangkok and family and so on. And he said, in this country, he said, mothers-in-law, they are peculiar blood. And my wife and I looked a little bit puzzled. He could see we were puzzled. And suddenly he came in a big smile on his face. He said, no, he said, not peculiar blood, bloody peculiar. So, it's a worldwide problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, they were a good crowd.
So you did 2.5 years as an instructor, and then you went to the
test pilot school.
Did you get posted there, or was that a choice?
No. At the end of every year, you always sent a form to fill in showing what you had done and where you wanted to go for your next posting. Not that they took any notice of it, but I wrote down at the top of my choice, Empire Test Pilot School.
What was the appeal of being a test pilot?
A little more advanced aircraft, interesting, exciting, and things happened very quickly. Within a matter of a few weeks, I was told I was to report to Farnborough for a 3-day interview. So I went down there and I was interviewed for 3 days, IQs, general knowledge of flying. You had to be above or exceptional pilot to be accepted. You had to be not beyond a certain age, things like that. And so I passed that course. Because about 4 weeks later, I had another letter saying I was posted on special duties to start at Farnborough at the Empire Test Pilot School on January 1958.
Wow. Must have been exciting.
I was very excited because I had just finished my tour at Cambridge University.
The instructing.
I think one of the reasons why I got there was the president of the interview was Air Commodore Arthur Clouston from Collingwood. In the 1920s, he used to help my grandfather, who was a surveyor, help him on his surveying trips. And it finally ended up in 1959, when I ended up at Boscombe Down. He was my boss.
Wow.
Yes.
It's who you know, isn't it?
It's who you know. It helps an awful lot.
Yeah. Well, that was a stroke of luck.
So a few weeks later, I ended up at Farnborough at the Empire Test Pilot School. We had about 13 different types of aircraft there, including a helicopter, which we all had to fly but weren't expected to master that one. But all the other aircraft were, from the Chipmunk to the Piston Provost, Vampires, Meteors, the Fairy Gannet twin-engine thing, Varsity, and the Canberra. And we were given a month to get through virtually 12 aircraft, get to know them. So we're given pilot's notes for about 3 aircraft a week, and that was our aim, to become familiar with
Just
3 aircraft.
By self-studying? You didn't sit a proper course for the airplanes, or?
No, we did get some dual on the Fairy Gannet and the Varsity, big twin-engine thing, or relatively big, and the Canberra. For the Canberra, I was given an hour's dual one afternoon. We landed. I got back in with the flight engineer who made sure I knew how to start the engines and anything else. And I did an hour with him. And I'm not certain, but I may have done another hour with an engineer the next day. Because only a few weeks later, my first exercise was investigating the high-speed handling of a Canberra at high Mach numbers. Part of the Empire Test Pilots course training was to exceed all your previous limitations laid down, and from exceeding them, understand why the final speed was selected. So you had to always go beyond what was recommended. And in the Canberra, at high altitude and high Mach numbers, in those days only about 0.84 or 5, it became very rough. And I was going up to just over 50,000 feet and diving. Each time it got rougher and rougher, and I looked at my flight engineer. He had the pilot's notes open, and he was reading them, hadn't said a word. And I said, "It's all right, Bob," I said, "on the next one will be the last flight."
Did he know you only had 1 hour in the aeroplane or 2 hours?
Yeah, yes.
He's a brave man.
Yes, he was. And so I climbed up for the last flight, and I looked, he was still reading the pilot's notes, and I looked a little bit harder, and he had it open at the back pages. Emergencies, abandoning the aircraft in flight. And the only exit was on his side. We had no ejector seats in the early things. So he was well prepared.
But you didn't have to abandon.
We didn't have to abandon. But it got pretty rough.
Yeah.
Just couldn't see the instrument panel, and controls would snatch and buck, and it was rough.
When you were heading out on missions like that, especially in the early days with very little time under your belt as a test pilot, how did you feel? Were you scared or nervous, or did you have confidence in your abilities that,
You had confidence in your engineers and interest.
But you didn't feel scared?
No, I don't recollect ever feeling scared.
Or nervous? Or
no, things could go wrong. My daughter said, "You must have been terrified at times." I said, "No, you're not terrified. You've got something to do. Something's gone wrong, and you get on and do it. you don't think of terror. You just get on and do what has to be done.
Yeah, I know when you get a lot of experience in an aeroplane, or anything for that matter, but talking about aeroplanes, things become easier and more natural. But when you're brand new to one and you don't have that muscle memory, um, maybe it's just me, but I know you can feel nervous just going on a normal flight, especially if maybe there's some challenges like weather or
Yes.
um, but doing test flying to 50,000 feet at high Mach numbers, that's just next level. Can you talk about the course, the test flying course? Because I think in the book,
Well,
from
that
memory,
was,
you said it was a fantastic course.
yes. You had to find out why things should be reduced, why you shouldn't exceed certain numbers and so on, because of controls getting heavy or severe vibration or something like that. You had to go into it very carefully. In the early 50s, a lot of test pilots did die because going just that little bit too far and what they meant to.
Yeah, I guess there was a lot more unknowns then than there is today in terms of aerodynamic forces and
Yes,
exceeding things. Right, so your job was to push the boundaries, find out what happened, and then
reduce them.
reduce them to a safe amount for the normal pilot
That's correct.
and for the normal operating procedures of the aeroplane.
Yes.
Um, Another thing that I thought about is it's not all about hand flying skills, obviously. I mean, you must have had to have had a high degree of technical knowledge of all these aeroplanes you were flying. Um, was that up to your self discipline to study and learn all that, or was that provided to you in courses?
You did courses and a lot of your own study.
Because you mentioned that you weren't very good at maths.
I wasn't very good at maths, no.
So
Or engineering, really. It was,
this job would have been, it required a high degree of mathematical knowledge, I guess, and engineering
yes, I learned
understanding.
a lot at Rolls-Royce.
Mm.
Yes, I went to a number of courses there on their engines, and they were very good.
And you volunteered for a helicopter conversion to try and get away from the maths. Was that right?
Oh, yes. And the, the test pilot's course was in 3 sections, like schools normally did. And the first section, the assistant technical manager, he wanted to learn to fly. And we had a chipmunk there. And in the evenings, I could get the chipmunk for half an hour and show him how to fly. And he had helped me with my calculations and so on. Once I got the first row done, I could then follow on and fill in all the other. Sometimes you'd have as many as 19 different columns to fill in.
Of calculations for what?
Yes.
For what? What sort of calculations?
Oh, on air pressures, air speeds, all sorts of things like that. They were quite advanced. But once I was shown them, I could follow. At the end of the first course, first term, he got posted to another place, and I was left absolutely bereft. I didn't see how I could continue. And at the same time as I announced this, that he was leaving, they said, we want 3 volunteers to become helicopter test pilots at Buscombe Down next year. So I thought, I know nothing about helicopters, neither do the other two applicants. They will make it easier for us, give us easy things to do, but they didn't. We were given easier aircraft to fly, but all the calculations and so on all had to be done.
So your great plan backfired a little bit.
My great plan backfired in a way, because at the end of the year, I passed out with 34 hours, 40 minutes on a rubbishy old Dragonfly, an S-51, and I was classed as a qualified helicopter test pilot.
With 34 hours?
The 34 hours.
Wow.
It takes 50 hours now to become a PPL on helicopters.
So did you feel confident in the machine after 34 hours?
No. They sent us to Culdrose, the Royal Naval Air Station at Culdrose in Cornwall. We did another fortnight there of fairly intensive flying, again in the same aircraft.
So you did 34 hours plus a fortnight,
Yes.
And then you're into testing.
Yes. And about another 5 months later, I was doing tropical trials out in Aden, that dreadful place I showed you. And there, on this very underpowered Skeeter helicopter, the maximum height I could ever get to was something like 6,700 feet. I tried twice. I couldn't exceed that height. Even in the First World War, planes were flying a lot higher than that. 18 months after that, I was in Canada doing icing on rotor blade icing, rotor blade icing protection. So the learning curve was very steep.
Absolutely. And you flew all different types of helicopters over the...
Flew quite a number, yes.
So after your helicopter steep learning curve, you got a phone call from Bristol Siddeley Engines, which, from reading between the lines, really changed the direction of your career a lot.
Absolutely.
Do you want to talk about how that played out?
I was rung up to say, would I become their first helicopter test instructor at Farnborough, where I just left and just moved up north. I said, I can't go, I haven't passed the exams. I'll make you an acting squadron leader. I said, no, I really want to learn how to fly helicopters in action. And instead of ordering me, they said, go to CFS, where you want to go. And it was there that I became an instructor, which was very valuable. But I found they wanted me to stay on as an instructor of their instructors.
Right.
And I didn't want to do that. And I was very pleased one morning to get a call from Tom Frost, chief pilot of Bristol Siddeley Engines in Bristol. Would I like to join them as a helicopter test pilot? I said, yes, I would. I was fed up with all the paving stones around the paths and so on, alternately painted black and white. You were saluted. For about 8 years, I'd been at the University Air Squadron, which was like a flying club. I'd been on special duties at test pilot school, where you had to turn up one day in civilian clothes just to show that you're out of the Air Force. Then I had nearly 3 years at Boscombe Down, and suddenly I was back in the Air Force, where you moved, you were saluted and all that rubbish. So I said yes, and a few months later I was with Bristol Siddeley at Bristol, Fulton,
As a civilian.
as a civilian.
Mm.
Yes. My first job was instructing Bristol helicopters pilots at Red Hill and out in Iran at Abadan. I had to instruct those at Red Hill first of all, then flew a helicopter out to Iran.
So what year was that?
That was in 1963.
Wow, so this is years before the Iranian Revolution.
Oh yes.
Mm. Iran was probably
Yes,
quite a
indeed
nice
it
place,
was.
quite a friendly
Bristow
place
was
there.
very lucky to get a lot of his helicopters out of the country.
Mm. What were they doing over there? Was it oil rig work? Or?
Oil rig work out in the Persian Gulf.
Right.
Yes.
I found an interesting write-up by a guy called William Ashpole, and he flew for Bristow in 1964, and he worked with Bob Balls, who...
I know Bob Balls, yes.
Yeah, and I think you ferried a Whirlwind helicopter with Bob Balls to Iran. Was that right? You tell a story about him drinking a lot of coffee and having to get rid of it.
Bob Balls might have been an engineer.
Maybe
I know the fellow you mean. Yes, he was very free with his orange and coffee and so on before we left Rhodes for Beirut. Yes, he couldn't seem to drink enough. And showed up about 2 hours later. And he said, Bernie, you have control. And he unstrapped himself somehow or another and all your gear. And he said, oh, that's better. He pulled out this old Durex, held it out over my knee, and the old aircraft was shaking away like that. I looked at it, quite a lot of horror. I said, put it away, empty it over the side. He was most upset when he slid the window back and emptied it out over the side, rolled it up and put it back in his
for the next time.
Pocket for the next time. Yes.
That could have ended up messy.
Yes, it might have been Bob Balls. There was an engineer there, similar name.
So that ferry flight must have been an interesting experience to Iran.
Yes, we had to, that's where we went through Iraq, Baghdad, when it was 48 degrees. And I had a New Zealand passport. I was flying a British registered helicopter. They cause a lot of trouble.
In Iraq.
In Iraq, yeah, Baghdad. Dreadful place.
You don't seem a fan of the Middle East in general.
No, I'm not a fan of the Middle East, no. Anyway, we cleared off and eventually got to Kuwait and did my training there and came back. During all this time back in Bristol, they were carrying on with stones and birds and things like that were having a detrimental effect on jet engines. So there's a lot of research going on that. The old story is that they get an engine at the test bed and running up to full power and then fire. It had to be a 4-pound chicken in the intake. And of course it was an absolute disaster to the engine. This happened several times. And the old story is, you've probably heard it, someone came along, probably a pilot, said, "Why don't you try a fresh chicken instead of a frozen chicken?" And that seemed to cure things a lot. Anyway,
Not too many frozen chickens flying
no,
around the sky.
that's right. I was taxiing out one morning from Bristol in our scout helicopter, and I could hear our Hawker Siddeley 125 executive jet positioning about 15, 20 miles away, coming into land. And so I taxied out to the runway. Down the far end of the runway on the grass was a pack of starlings, thousands of them. So I thought, well, don't want them here, don't want them when the aircraft lands. So I was very gentle about it. I ambled down towards them, chased them all away, and they all flew up over the other side and landed on the grass on the other side of the runway. It upset me a bit. I thought, well, I'll get you lot out of the way. So I accelerated away, climbed up, did a dumbbell sort of turn and dive back at them with a tailwind. So I was going a bit faster than I expected. And just before I was going to get in amongst them, I started to pull up, and they, being faster than expected, they all pulled up as well. And suddenly I was surrounded by starlings. I could see about 600 or 800 getting taken into the engine, blocking that off. I could see another 200 or 300 striking the tail rotor and getting that out of balance so to take out the gearbox at the rear end of the aircraft. And so I'd just dive. And all I could see was us being a smouldering wreck in the middle of the runway. And I said, "Oh, shit!" And every single starling heard me. And they did that. And the rotors sucked it all down, all over the centre part of the aircraft. I could not see out of the windscreen. It was about a quarter of an inch deep in excrement.
Wow.
Absolutely blacked out. So I hit the windscreen wipers. That just spread it all around. Made no difference at all. Fortunately, there was a clear vision panel just down here, and I managed to flick that open and came to a very unsteady hover up at about 100 feet. And I could see the ground. I was safe again. And I looked down at poor old Mike Jenkins, my observer. He was lying back in his seat. He had a white face and he had big black eyes. And he said, "Shit." I said, "It is." And we hover taxied crab-like back to the hangar where we were hosed down. Do you know, I couldn't find a feather or a bone or a trace of blood anywhere on that aircraft. I never ever felt anything hit it. It was just amazing.
Yeah. They must have all lightened their loads and gone.
Yes, yes. Not a trace of a bird anywhere. Normally, if you hit a bird in flight, just one or two, and you see the remains, but not here.
You might have got
So
a wee bit
we
lucky
washed
that
it
day.
down, had a cup of coffee, and went off and did our job again.
And that was in a Scout.
That
right?
was on a Scout helicopter.
You tell a couple of other stories about flying the Scout. I think you did some engine restart testing at high altitude in the Scout.
Oh, yes. Yes, out in, we sold Scouts out to Uganda or somewhere, where Kilimanjaro is. I think goes up to about 12,000 feet or something. They were having trouble starting. So well, the only way to do this is to go up high. We used to have a standard procedure. All our relighting, after you shut down, you had to wait for 2 minutes to imagine an average sort of bloke having a look around, seeing what went wrong and getting around to starting it. So you had to go up high. They come down at 2,500 feet a minute. So eh, to get a start at 12,000, you had to go up about 20,000. So I did that, but found out if you press the starter button at 12,000 feet, before it would relight again, you were down somewhere around about 6,000 or 7,000 feet, which was defeated the object.
Mm.
So I had to go back up again. And this time I did the start at about 14 or 16,000 feet. So we could get a start at 10 or 12,000. And we did that. Then there was one other occasion. We were being pressurized by industry or something to get some tests completed by the end of March, March 31st. And our engineers are adamant it should be done, otherwise they would not get paid. They're going to lose thousands of pounds. And for days beforehand, we just had stratus cloud over there. It was base around about, I don't know, 1,500, 2,000 feet, and tops about 4,000 or 5,000 feet. And they wanted to see if it would start at 10,000 feet. Or what? No, if what the RPM fell to if you closed the throttle at 10,000 feet. And didn't sound terribly wise. I think the cloud base might have been lower, about 1,000 feet. If things didn't go right, 1,000 feet didn't give me very much room underneath.
Mm.
So I kept putting it off and putting it off, and they kept getting more and more agitated. And at last they said, "Oh, you can see a beam of light coming down through the far end of the runway, a ray of light. Go." And like an idiot, I went. And I climbed up through the hole, that was no problem. 10,000 feet, and the wind took us out over the city of Bristol. And fortunately, I was with air traffic on their radar. I said, right, I'm going to close the throttle, just check what our RPM fall to. I was watching out, making sure all was clear, well clear of the cloud, and closed the throttle. He said, "Bernie," I said, "yes." He said, "It's 0." And down we started, 2,500 feet a minute. And as far as I could tell, we were pretty well over the centre of Bristol. And he said, "Shit," which I thought covered things pretty well. And I went through all the start-up procedures twice to make sure it was essential that we get it going.
Mm.
And we did. We got it going just as we got into cloud.
Wow.
And
very scary
things, yes.
Yeah. And there was one other story which was quite amusing quite a lot of years later when you were doing a display at Wanaka Air Show.
Oh, yes. At the end of the show, I taxied into the fuel past the VIP area. And I think they had about 8 or 10 portaloos lined up along there, alongside my taxiway. And I didn't see it happen at all. I just heard about it. I taxied past them. I blew the first 3 over with all their contents by the VIP hangar. The 4th one I didn't blow over, but the door blew open and there was a young lady there sitting down or trying to sit down, panties around her knees, skirt up high, toilet paper everywhere. Terribly embarrassed.
Bloody Bernie Lewis and his scout.
Yes. Yes.
That's funny. So you were flying various model of helicopters all over the world for anyone that needed engine testing, basically. Is that how it worked?
Yes, well, Rolls-Royce, I like being with an engine company. If you flew with an airframe company, you just flew their 2 or 3 models. Because we made engines for people all over the world, all sorts of engines. And the Austrian Air Force, and the Iraqi Air Force, they all used our engines and helicopters there. And they had problems, so I'd go out and fly with them.
And you must have been flying fixed wing as well.
We flew fixed wing as well.
Yeah.
Because again, both those aircraft are powered by the same engine, the Orpheus engine.
So what are these aeroplanes here?
The top one is the Gnat, used by the Red Arrows, with the Orpheus engine, and the bottom one is the Fiat G91, an Italian-built aircraft.
Looks
with,
a bit
with
like
our engine.
Looks a bit like a Skyhawk.
It looks very much like a Sabre.
Right.
So we were a bit short on pilots, and there was no one left to fly the G91. So I'd flown the Sabre, looked much the same. So I was fortunate I took our Hawker Siddeley 125 because I had a rating on that and an instrument rating. I could fly all around Europe in the 125 or the Jetstream later. I took some people out to Munich and then I flew up to the base, a place called Manching. I think it's a research and development place for the German Air Force. And I did 2 hours there. And then I went to work on a squadron up at a place called Husum in Schleswig, just north of Hamburg, where we had our engine, specially fitted engine, checked engine to do some work on. They'd had some problems with they had 2 30mm cannons on either side of the air intake. When the cannons fired, a lot of the gases from the shells got sucked down into the engine.
Okay.
And was causing problems. So we had a specially instructed and checked engine. So I had to go up and fly with them for a while at various speeds, and then at the end fire the guns, make sure all was okay.
And you were flying the aeroplane by yourself? It's a single,
absolutely,
just a single
yes.
pilot machine.
Yes.
Yeah. So here, a few years after the war, you're flying for the Luftwaffe.
I was flying for Luftwaffe. The only time I probably had a trace of fear. I've read all the Biggles books, or a lot of them. I'd read an outfit called Rockfist Rogan RAF. They were all fighting aircraft, big black crosses. During the war, I had a brother over there dodging aircraft with big black crosses on them. So it is deep in my mind. And suddenly I was flying around, minding my own business, taking all the correct readings required, and all being a reasonable pilot. Every now and again I'd have a look around to see where I was, and there was a great big black cross about 20 feet away. And I thought, how did he get there? I did not see him coming. He's going to
shoot me
destroy me any second. And caught me out several times. I couldn't get over it.
I can see how that could happen. I mean, we're just ingrained,
Yes,
as you were,
it
even more
was
so.
in my mind.
Yeah.
He had got in that close. He was just going to destroy me. And I got on wonderfully with that German squadron. All the briefings in the morning, mat briefings, everything was all in perfect English, as all their air traffic control. You fly anywhere over Germany, and if you're talking to air traffic control, it's all in perfect English.
Wow.
They were marvellous. During the week, the commandant called me and he said, "Mr. Lewis," he said, "it's great of you to come over here and help us when we have this little problem." He said, "And for you, you know that we open up the hangars at 8 on Monday morning, close them at 5 on Friday. For you, we will keep this airfield open all weekend." Now that's refuelers, that's engineers, that's ambulances, that's air traffic control, all sorts of little extras like that. It cost a lot. He said, "For you, we will keep the airfield open, but please, on Sunday morning, will you not fly low over the churches?" I thought that was lovely.
Yeah.
Not so many years before, we've been in each other's throats.
No.
They were great.
It's a funny old world, how quickly things change,
It is indeed.
Isn't it? Yeah. So there's a few other interesting jobs you had with Rolls-Royce that I noted down. One was the icing testing in the HS-125 jet.
Oh, yes.
That looked a bit scary. Maybe it wasn't scary, but it looked it.
Well, it was probably a bit stupid. We got hold of a Canberra with a big tankage of water and spray gear at the back. And we, de Havilland's, as it was in those days, they'd had an engine failure over in Munich, taking off in snow or something like that. And they said it was all our fault. It was all Rolls-Royce's fault that the engine had stopped. So we got this tanker and we went up to about 7,000 or 8,000 feet, which is a good temperature for ice. And then I flew the 125 over into the spray, which we could see. And we watched the ice build up, and it built up pretty well. We got to a stage where it was stupid. I found that it was very difficult to hold that wing up. I thought afterwards that was sheer stupidity. Anyway, it got to a stage where we had to go down, and we called them up. And of course, as we came down, it got warmer and warmer, and suddenly great big blocks of ice went straight back into the engine. And we felt everything thud as the ice hit the intake and the cell and so on. The engine didn't fluctuate. It didn't quiver. And we went back using a normal power and landed, and we found that the nacelle, it was really bent and buckled around. And I think we did something to the engine as well, but it had behaved perfectly.
Maybe that engine was tested with frozen chickens and not.
Maybe, yes.
It was lucky.
No, it was I think in the book there it showed, it is a big build-up of ice all over the leading edge.
Yeah, huge.
Mm.
Amazing that it even flew with one wing like that.
Yes.
Another amazing story was testing the Concorde engine on the bottom of the Vulcan bomber.
Yes.
That seems like something which, looking back, was something to be proud of being part of.
Well, we had it flying 3 or 4 years before Concorde ever flew, and we had it pretty thoroughly tested from sea level up to 50,000 feet and up to Mach 0.98 with pressure errors and things like that. It was probably nearer point about 9.4, but we gave it a good thorough seeing to under the Vulcan.
Mm. So what was the performance of flying the Vulcan like with the Concorde engine running as well?
Oh, well, it just doubled the power. We used to use chase aircraft like the Gnat.
The Gnat, yeah.
And occasionally a Hunter 6, which is the twin, I think. And as soon as he said he was climbing from 30,000 to 50,000 feet, it just pretty well disappear like that. Just a wonderful performer.
Mm. With a fuel burn to match.
Yes, I think it was something like about 6,000 gallons an hour from one engine.
It's unbelievable. How big was the fuel tank?
Yes. Well, I think these America's Cup yachts learnt something from it, because what do they sail in about 15 knots and knock up about 50 knots or something like that.
Mm.
On the Concorde, the engine produced something like about 20% of the power. About 30% of the power came from flaps and everything in the front.
Aerodynamic design.
Yes. And the rest came from various flaps and nozzles at the rear.
Wow.
The engine just produced a minute amount at Mach 2 at 60,000 feet. It would be at maximum cruise. And that's all the power.
I didn't know that.
That produced. And I'm sure the Americans or the America's Cup people cottoned onto this somehow.
Yeah.
I don't follow it.
It's pretty amazing, though. It's pretty clever, isn't it?
Yes.
You tested the Jetstream aircraft, the Handley H Jetstream, which is still flying today. Unbelievably.
My son said I have a love-hate relationship with the Jetstream.
But it had different engines, didn't it?
Oh, it had different engines. it had the Astor Zoo, which is a pretty underpowered engine, really, and not much power at all. But the engine was all right. It was the going from the engine to the throttles,
which is quite important.
which was very important. And I don't know how many engine failures I had out of it. Probably about 6 or 7 or 8 or something like that, which is an excessive amount.
Yeah.
But it all created somehow a bit of excitement. On the last we got fed up with it, we decided to take it down to Pau, which is where Turbomaker operate from, down in sort of southwest France. So we cleared customs at Fulton, taxied out. On the takeoff run, the engine failed. Or the engine didn't fail, the system failed. So back I go, back through customs, back out through customs when they'd fixed it. And off we went. Got up to about 300 feet this time, and again it failed. So I said to my mate, Dave Wilkinson, I said, well, the most dangerous thing with this aircraft is the takeoff. Let's start that up and we'll go down to Pau. So we did that, and we got down to Pau. And the French, not like the Germans, the French, they had British registration. And we were nicely lined up for the runway. In fact, I think we had been cleared to land. And they sent in a Nor Atlas, one of their troop-carrying things, in ahead of us and touched down in front of us. If I'd been smarter, I would have said, Je suis New Zealander. Vive la All Blacks. But I didn't.
You were probably just trying to keep the engine going.
It was the French. They just had to be one up all the way through. Same with the Concorde. They were the first ones to fly 001. They were the first ones to reach Mach 1. They were the first ones to reach Mach 2. They were the first ones to crash. But the Jetstream,
But as an aircraft, as an airframe, what do you think?
It flew very well. That's what I liked about it. Except one morning we left it out for an overnight soak. There's some snow forecast. So we left it out and went out in the morning and wiped all the snow off the wings and sprayed the essential parts and checked that everything moved. And it taxied out. And I made a mistake there. My observer, he is having trouble writing things down, so I turned on the cockpit lights so that he could see properly. Then we lined up and we took off, and it was a bad morning. It was low cloud. It was somewhere around the top of the old Brabazon hangar, which is about 100 feet up. So just got airborne. I suddenly realised I didn't have any proper instrument lighting. So I reached up and I turned off the cockpit lighting. And it was the only lighting I had, because it was only the lights I'd use. So I took a swipe and I took a whole lot of lights on and I got airborne, cycled down the carriage a couple of times to get rid of any ice and stuff, and level out at 5,000. And I like my flying to be reasonably precise on instruments. And I kept checking around, and I noticed I was nearly up to 5,100 feet, so I gave it a little nudge on the old trimmer and carried on. Looked back a few seconds later, and we were about 5,150. And I thought, that's serious, that's out of the way. And I gave the stick a bit of a push, and I found it didn't budge. It was absolutely solid. And I realised I was probably iced somewhere or another. So the old adrenaline really kicked in.
Yeah.
And I heaved myself back in the seat and I pushed, and there's a big crack, and controls freed up again. But as soon as I let go, they froze again. So there I was. I had either frozen controls or free controls. I couldn't really land back. It was well below my limits. Perhaps in those days I should have checked, see what other airfields are open, but didn't do that. Anyway, I could see several possibilities. None of them are terribly good. And I suddenly remembered that in a Matt talk years ago, the Matt man said, the higher you go, the water crystals get smaller and crisper. And I thought, well, I wonder if that's so. And I carried on climbing, and got out of cloud at about 10,500, 11,000 feet. And it was just magic. All the controls freed. It was
Wow.
just like that. Everything became perfectly normal.
Wow. Quite a brave move to keep climbing.
I had no problem at all. I thought, gee, well, we're a bit too low to go back and land. Anyway, to have to go through that freezing patch again. So we'll do some levels power checks at 15,000 feet. So we got up to that, and suddenly there's a thump, and started pretty heavy vibration. That had me a bit puzzled, and I said to my observer, I bet it's the right-hand engine. I'll shut it down very carefully. And it was. And I saw it was a three-bladed propeller, and it had ice on either two blades or one blade. It's giving us all a problem. I said, well, while we're up here at 15,000, we'll do some level power checks on one engine. So he set that all up, and I just noticed we couldn't hold 15,000 feet. And I then realised that we'd only had it for a few hours. And maybe its single height was somewhere around about 4,000 or 5,000 feet. And at that stage, over there, you could dial up a certain frequency. You could get the weather at several airports around England, and Orly and Jersey and Manchester and London and so on like that, regular. And Orly and Jersey were the only two free airports anywhere around, and we were starting to get lower and lower. I thought, I think we'll head for Jersey. Anyway, it's a bit further south, from here. So we were starting to get seriously low, I think. And I said to my mate, I said, we might have to have a little bit of vibration for a while. So we started the starboard engine again. There was a couple of bangs, and everything came perfectly correct because it had just shed the ice off the other blades. So we went back and we had the next 3 or 4 hours just flying around doing power checks and what have you. And eventually our traffic said, well, the base has gone up to 450 feet now. So it's looking a bit better. Visibility's good. So we headed back and did a nice radar approach. Went to turn off the end of the runway on the old nose wheel steering. That was frozen too. So it had the last laugh.
Yeah.
But no problem. We had asymmetric engines, we had brakes and so on.
Pretty exciting flight.
But it was an interesting flight, yes.
Yeah. So all these Jetstream pilots these days have got you to thank for all this testing and sorting things out.
Well, they've got a different engine.
Yeah.
But the aircraft itself flew very well. I enjoyed it. That's why my son said you have a love-hate relationship with it.
Yeah. And then one other aeroplane was the VC-10, and you were testing the RB211 engine.
Yes.
So this is a big aeroplane. It's pretty serious machines.
That was a serious engine too, because of one of the first of the big fan engines. They replaced the one on the port side.
That would have been a bit of fun flying that aeroplane.
I preferred the Vulcan. I think we only flew it about 5 times, and I think 3 times we had to land on using just the 2 Conway engines because we ran out of fuel.
Yeah.
It wasn't very good at the start. We used to have to run up at pretty well full power for, I think it was about 9 minutes or something at the end of the runway before we could take off to let various tolerances take up.
Okay. So you finished with Rolls-Royce in 1971, was that right?
Yes.
Thereabouts. Just a couple of questions about your general time as a test pilot. Did you have any aircraft that scared you in that time?
Not really. I just love flying.
Mm.
It wasn't going to work, it was going to play. I've never had such a lovely time in all my life.
Wow.
We had so many different aircraft there. And at the last we only got down to about, for various reasons, down to about 2 pilots, old Harry Pullett, myself, and I think you'll see I might have had a logbook entry somewhere just to show you the sort of things we flew. That was in 1963.
I made a note. I'll just read out a paragraph from your book. It kept me very busy, and I put in long hours from dawn and frequently until 10 o'clock at night. In between times, I kept flying other aircraft. Looking through my logbooks, I could fly a varied number of aircraft throughout the day. For example, the Strike Master on relighting, the Vulcan flying test bed with the Olympus Concorde engine underneath, or the Folan Gnat as a chase aircraft, the Westland Sea King or a Westland Whirlwind, both on engine development. We flew the 3rd Handley Page Jetstream prototype and the 3rd prototype HS-145 on intensive flying.
125.
125 on intensive flying engine trials. We also had a couple of de Havilland Doves, which we used for flying staff around the UK or to the continent. Just a huge amount of variety.
It was a huge amount. As I said, the last we just seemed to end up with two pilots, Harry Pollitt and myself. If we flew the Vulcan, that's usually an afternoon thing, usually on a Friday, because all the men got overtime because they'd carry on till Saturday. And if we had any spare time in the evening, they'd say, "Oh, can you take so and so and two or three other passengers down to Toulouse, where the Concorde was being built down there, or Boscombe down short of a part for the Harrier. They're down at Catania, down in Sicily. Can you go there this afternoon?" And you'd get on the 125 and you'd go down there. These third prototypes, all the company wanted was to get hours on them.
Right.
And so used to fly them as much as possible. Like when we went to, when we had the Jetstream, we thought, well, we could go a long way. This thing's supposed to go 2,000 miles at 300 miles an hour at 30,000 feet or something like that. We don't believe it. So Harry and I looked at it and he decided to go to Copenhagen and I'd go down to Malta. I said Malta will be a good little testing place. It should be around about 1,400 miles or something like that. So I'd set off in the afternoon with the navigator, who had as well as navigating, had a how goes it chart, how for fuel and alternates. We had Palermo as an alternate, and we'd be getting down there, and opposite Palermo, this would be about 6, 7 o'clock at night, or might be a little bit later. Should we go and have a pasta and hear them speak Italian, or should we go on to Malta and have a steak? Hear them.
Decisions of a test pilot.
Decision. Look, it wasn't work.
Yeah.
It was just lovely fun.
Not many people get an opportunity
Not
like that in their
many people
lives.
get an opportunity like that. Harry went up and did his trip to Copenhagen.
And there was another interesting thing you spoke about cockpit ergonomics. You said it never failed to amaze me how aircraft designers managed to put two similar levers alongside one another. The activation of either will produce two totally different results, one of them usually very abrupt.
Yes.
I refer to the undercarriage and flap levers in the Meteor,
Yes.
the oil cooler shutters and fuel cocks in the Dove,
Yes.
and the power select lever and the fuel cock lever in the Whirlwind, and you also mentioned the 5 Vampire fuel gauges.
Yes. Well, in the Meteor, just up here on top of the instrument panel, were two little stalky bits came out. One had a round knob on it, one had a cross piece on it. One did the flaps and the other did the undercarriage. I know of one crowd who came in, we'd been having a bit of a joust with them. A new bloke to the number 2 squadron was of the Meteors. He came in from a jolly good dogfight, and he instead of raising the flaps, he raised the undercarriage.
Easy to do.
As you do.
Yeah.
And then the Dove with another test pilot. We'd taken some people up to Hucknall, the headquarters of Rolls-Royce. I'd flown up in the morning, he navigated. On the way back, he flew, and I was navigating. We got under some cloud at 3,000 feet, bowling along there, and suddenly everything started shaking, and I do not know why. I reached down and I put both fuel cocks back on because the fuel and the oil cock were again stalky bits with round knobs on the end of them.
So all these amazing cockpits we have these days that have been well thought out are all,
Yes.
due to crashes and mistakes back in your time.
That's right.
Mm. So you finally left England and came back to New Zealand after a pretty exciting career over there. You came back did some flying in a 206 for aerial surveys, and you did some years of ag work in a helicopter, and then you joined the CAA for 7 years.
Yes.
And it sounds like you had a pretty interesting time there dealing during the period of the venison wars
Deer
and
poaching,
the
yes.
deer poaching and the helicopters. What was your role in that?
Just trying to catch these poachers.
Trying to keep these cowboys in control.
Yes, yes.
Were you successful?
Not terribly well. Yes. Deer were regarded as pests, and everyone seemed to welcome anyone who shot deer.
Mm.
And suddenly the price of venison went up, and the farmers found that they had quite profitable animals on their ranches and so on. And of course, the cowboys with their guns and so on, they thought, no reason why I can't go and grab a few myself.
Mm.
And they'd do so. They'd do fairly well. But we had to try and stop them get them for low flying, get them for landing on private property without permission.
What methods did you use to try and catch them in the act? Did you sort of hide out and wait for them?
We'd hear from some particular area which is what's the best part of a helicopter, bring it down slowly. That sort of alerted us a little bit. And we found any busy area where on a couple of occasions we would go and hire a helicopter from our work or somewhere like that. And with another inspector and the odd policeman, we'd go on, we'd spend a few nights in a hut out on the hills and hopefully catch some.
Did you have any get a bit aggressive to you or take pot shots at you or anything?
Apparently they did do earlier on before I joined. There was a bit of an altercation once, but they didn't with us. We sort of had a amicable sort of arrangement. Some used to go a little bit too far, but he eventually killed himself. So
Seems like
that got rid of one big problem.
Yeah. Seems like whatever job you did, it was exciting.
Yes. Yes.
The next exciting thing in your career was flight testing the Pacific Aerospace Cresco.
Yes.
That was before it was even certified, was it?
That was before it was certified, yes. It had to be put through spinning trials before it would be certified.
And how did it spin?
Yes, it very reluctant. Fortunately, we'd had a tail parachute fitted and used that to stop the spin.
Was it
very
reluctant to come out of the spin?
It just would not come out at all. No. And the ground seemed to be getting a lot closer, so I pulled the tail parachute, which just stopped us in time before it broke clear itself.
And did they fix that by
by fitting a dorsal fin?
Right.
Yes.
And then you had an amazing job offer with Faye Richwhite, which sounded like you really enjoyed this job flying their helicopter.
Yes.
So this must have been in the America's Cup days, was it?
It was just prior to the America's Cup days.
Yeah.
They started with the America's Cup over in Australia, didn't they? Yeah, we got this helicopter, or they bought it in 1987. And when they got into the New Zealand Challenge, after the big boat, which is a very big yacht, they went to a smaller one and raced that at San Diego. That's when they told me to sell the helicopter, as they're going to be away for quite a long time.
So would you fly around Michael Fay and all those people? And it was a Dauphin helicopter?
Yes. Lovely helicopter.
Did you fly it all over New Zealand?
Pretty well, yes. Down to Stewart Island, up to the Euston on Three Kings Island for the Merkin Marine Department, checking their lighthouse. So it went from one end of New Zealand to the other.
So you did some commercial work as well as work for them.
That's right, yes.
Yeah. IFR, yes. VFR?
Both.
Hmm.
Both. I was rated on IFR on it. Very nice machine.
Yeah, sounds like a great job. And you used it to fly the Duke of Edinburgh around Fiordlandon?
Yes. Yes, I took him from Invercargill to Stewart Island to meet the kakapo, and then up to Milford Sound, and then Okarito for the white heron.
How did you get chosen to do that job?
I just happened to have the best helicopter.
And the best pilot flying it.
Well, I had more hours on that one than anyone else.
Did he sit up the front? Did you get to interact with him?
Yes, on the last leg, I asked if he'd like to sit up front with me, and he did that. I think he probably learned to fly helicopters much the same time as I did in the late 50s. And he flew it reasonably well.
Yeah.
No problems at all. Of course, I did the takeoff and the landing. He did the in-between. The control column was exactly the same as in the Wessex, which he was be used to.
Did he have an entourage of security people following you around?
There was one on board, and the Air Force was 10 miles either side or each end.
Fun thing to be part of.
Yes.
And then, if that wasn't enough, you took up parachuting.
Oh, yes. Well, tandem.
Yeah.
Tandem parachuting.
How old were you when you did your first jump?
In my 80s.
In your 80s?
Somewhere, yes.
What made you go and do that?
Well, John Fennell in Taupo, probably know of John.
Yep.
He had a parachute school there as well, and he asked me to go down and do an audit for them. So I went down there, And he said, oh, by the way, I've got a parachute thing. I said, well, I know nothing about them. If you want me to do that, I have to start at the top and work my way down. So we did that. Done about 4 since, including one on the Great Mercury Island. Because I challenged old Michael Vey. I said, you'd better have a go at this, you'll enjoy it. He said, well, said everyone who comes out here for my birthday, March every year, he said they all come by boat or helicopter. What about you coming by parachute? I
So you
said,
did?
fair enough.
Where did you land? Was there a field or?
No, there's just a very small beachfront. Not very, rather on the small side.
I bet you were the hero of the day.
I did pretty well. Yes.
I've got a few last questions for you. In all your flying career, what would your favourite aircraft be that you've flown?
I think the American Sabre or the Dauphin.
Right. Why? Why did you enjoy them? Just their ease of handling.
The Sabre, it's called the Vampire, the stage 1. I think they're at about stage 5 now in jets. I think the Sabre would be a class 2 one, working its way up. It was big, it was comfortable, it had powered controls, it had ejector seats. None of the others did.
Yeah.
It had
just a generation ahead of what you were used to.
Yes, new generation. And much the same with the Dauphin. It was just a completely new generation. I could dial up various frequencies around Auckland. I wouldn't have to do anything. I'll just dial up the frequencies and press the odd button, and it'd do an automatic approach down to 80 feet above the ground. If I still couldn't see the ground, press the button and it would automatically climb out to the next beacon. It was lovely.
Yeah.
And it was waterproof.
And so that was was that in the 80s or maybe the 90s?
That would have been in the 80s. Yes, I
So
would have sold it. I sold it 92.
Yeah, so, I mean, we're still talking 30, 40 years ago. It's a pretty advanced machine back then, eh?
Yes.
Something you wrote, looking back over the years, I don't think that I would like to change anything in my career, but I had a certain amount of luck along the way. The most fortunate piece of luck that I had was when the RNZAF decided that they wouldn't train me to be a pilot. It was interesting thinking how different your career would be if you had got that job at the RNZAF. I'm sure you've thought of this many times.
Yes.
It wouldn't have been the same career, I'm sure.
It would have been flying, but it would have been dull.
Yeah.
It was Rolls Royce. It was anything but dull.
But you made your own luck, really, by taking that step and getting on the boat, didn't you?
Yes.
I mean, a lot of people would have taken the navigator job and made the best out of it, I suppose.
True, I suppose.
And it was interesting, you talk about my next bit of good luck was when I opted to volunteer to fly helicopters at the Empire Test Pilot School. But it seems to be you made your own luck by whenever a new opportunity came up, you seemed pretty keen to jump at it.
Yes.
Would that be right? Were you
Probably,
always looking for new things, new challenges? Yes. There's a poem on the last page of your book, which I just want to read out because it's a lovely poem. I don't know where you got it from, but you've been cruising the hills under heavy skies, maybe a little bit lonely and a little bit uncertain, when suddenly the westering sun finds a slit in the canopy overhead. Long after you've forgotten the sweat of the journey, you'll remember the glimpse of that sun-kissed valley, with the fingers of the hills all pointing to it, as though fearful that you might miss its loveliness. When you've flown enough years to have crossed many hills and valleys, and known much loneliness, and endured many uncertainties, why then you're a pilot, and on the walls of your memory are hung such frescoes as no other breed of man has ever seen, and because of them you can never grow old, and you can never be too afraid of what lies ahead. That talks about your career, I think, a bit. I don't know if it does to you, but
I don't remember the first bit. I remember the second. I don't know where I got that from.
Yeah, but it's a great poem, especially for someone with the experience that you've got. Anyway, thanks very much for talking to me. You've had an incredible career, and I've only met you twice, but I can see from the interactions with the people here at the retirement village, you have an impact on their lives. That lot, in a positive way. So I really appreciate the time, and all the best for your trip to Takaka in a couple of weeks.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks, Bernie.
Yeah.